All right, looks like it's about 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. But before I start, I do have to share, I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is, this is the last 9 o'clock lecture of Mises University 2025. So we can all weep. Right? The good news is that I know what sleep is like this week, and I'm very tolerant of sleeping during my lecture, as long as someone wakes me at the end. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the economics of interventionism, which is our topic for this morning. So the way that this talk came about is that when they organize Mises University, they have a certain set of lectures they specifically invite people to do. So like my game theory lecture yesterday, they specifically asked me to do that one. And then sometimes there are gaps in the schedule. So well, they know they want somebody to speak, but they don't really know what about. And this was one of those gaps. They said, oh, pick a topic, and you can talk about that. So yesterday I talked about game theory. I said I developed that lecture because I like it. Today I'm talking about interventionism because I don't like it. So there we go. But nonetheless, when I looked at the schedule, I realized we talk a lot about specific interventions, right? So you have things like the minimum wage, for example. But we didn't really have anywhere that we're talking about interventionism, right, as kind of a broader philosophical approach, paradigm for approaching economic policy. And nonetheless, I think this is something that is important for us to talk about if we want to understand what Mises's contributions are and how those have developed over time. Right, so I'm going to start out by defining what interventionism is and kind of giving the explanation of why I thought this is an important topic that we talk about. Then we'll look at Mises's arguments, claims related to interventionism, move into some of the developments that Murray Rothbard added to our analysis of interventionism, and then look at a couple of, I guess, more modern developments as well from Sanford Ikeda and Robert Higgs in looking at Mises's original claims and reevaluating them. Let's go ahead and get into this then. So what is interventionism? I think the best phrase to describe it, and you find this both in Mises and then Rothbard adopts this phrase as well, is that it's a hampered market economy. Which is to say, like, if we think about the extremes, the way this is often presented is on the one hand where you have socialism, communism, pick your title for that one, where we have just one will dominating, right, typically the will of the state being how we would describe that. On the opposite end, we have free markets, laissez-faire, capitalism, again, choose which term you like, and then interventionism is somewhere in the middle. It's kind of the way we describe this typically. Now, Mises doesn't like this. It's not really halfway in between, but at the same time, it's not either of the extremes. So it's not socialism because there's a clear separation between the capitalist entrepreneurs and also the state. Now, the state is trying to influence what capitalist entrepreneurs are doing, but nonetheless, it's not just one will dominating in economic activity. At the same time, it's not a free market that is unhampered. The state, after all, is intervening to redirect the market in the way that it behaves. So market participants are doing things other than they would have done in the absence of that state intervention. And so thinking of it as primarily market economy, capitalist entrepreneurs making production decisions, but at the same time, it's not totally free and unhampered. And so it isn't really halfway between. It's really a market economy, just one that is not allowed to operate as it wishes. Now, the reason I think this is really important for us to discuss is that I think this is, first, a very common paradigm in terms of how states actually run their economies nowadays. Secondly, I think it's a very common paradigm in terms of how most economists think about how the state should approach economies. And then finally, I think it's the common philosophy you'll find amongst the general public in terms of how the government should relate, right, to the economy. So evidence for each of these. Right, so I think it's fair to say that nearly every country in the world is at least somewhat interventionist. And I might make exceptions for those that are pure socialists, like North Korea, for example, but everything else basically is somewhat interventionist. Even in the US, where we know we rank 5th on the Fraser Institute's Index of Economic Freedom, so fairly free compared to the rest of the world. And nonetheless, if you look at our Code of Federal Regulations, that's the equivalent to 200 printed volumes of regulations, and that's just at the national level. And given this structure of the United States, add to that all the state level regulations, the local regulations, and all that, we live under a very heavily regulated economy. We can't just do whatever we want as long as we're respecting property rights. Rather, we have restrictions placed on the choices we can make. So just one example of local regulations. I like to talk about my township some, right? So my township has a zoning resolution. That's the title they use for it. It's a little over 130 pages long. Right? So how much my township cares about zoning. When you drive in, you see the signs as you enter. It says Lake Township, zoned for your protection. Right? So at this local level, we really want to make sure we protect people from having houses that are under 1,200 square feet built, right? These kinds of things. Causes great danger, I'm sure, to have a 900 square foot home. But nonetheless, that's the world that we seem to be living in. Now, I said also that I think this is a common paradigm amongst economists, for the most part. And I think this is true in that most economists accept that generally, right, markets lead us toward good outcomes. Nonetheless, there's a general belief that market failures exist. Right? And we have this nice list of market failures. So things like monopoly, public goods, the tragedy of the commons, externalities, information asymmetries, all of these things that lead the economy to act in ways that we wouldn't really like. And every time we introduce a new market failure, there's some call then for government to step in and fix, right, whatever these market failures are. I've heard it said that if you want to get a Nobel Prize in economics, probably the best path is to discover a new market failure and then suggesting the policy that will be able to fix it. Right? So, and I think it's fair to say that most economists would take this approach, that we need to have markets, but right, they need to be regulated in these cases of market failure. We have some people like Esther Duflo, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and she wrote a paper entitled The Economist as Plumber. And took this idea that we as economists should act kind of like plumbers. That is, we're designing the system, right? There's obviously involvement in policy for how the economy should work, but then we understand, as any plumber does, that yes, you can design this great system, but once you put it into place, it's not going to be perfect, right? So you're going to have to tweak it as you go, right? So we have here a very clear philosophy stated that governments should be listening to economists that are forming policy, and then as the policy doesn't work, we make these little tweaks here and there, try to get it to work better to accomplish our goals. Interestingly, this process almost sounds like something Mises is going to say, but we'll get to that. And then finally, I mentioned that I think this is the common philosophy held amongst the public. I will often survey my students when they come to class and just ask, how do you view socialism, favorably, unfavorably? How do you view capitalism, favorably, unfavorably? Kind of give those very favorable, somewhat favorable, that kind of scale. And what I generally find is that most of my students, now remember I'm mostly teaching business students, this might be a little bit different if you're in say sociology or something like that. Most of my students don't feel very favorably towards socialism. They generally feel more favorably towards something like capitalism, but they tend to use phrases when I ask them about this in more detail, is, well, we like markets, but regulated. That's the way that things need to run, markets, but regulated. And I think this is a very common approach. And you find different types of regulations being suggested by different people. So some people are, after all, worried about things like inequality. Dr. Thornton, I believe, is going to talk about that later this afternoon, or perhaps late this morning. Right, so we're worried about inequality and that being a potential market outcome. We don't like that, so we need to have the government step in and fix some of the excessive inequality. We're worried about discrimination against oppressed groups, so the government needs to step in. We've already heard Dr. Njoya talk about this. So the government needs to step in and fix this. We know how well that works, right? But nonetheless, we see calls for this. Or we also see others being concerned about things like national loyalty, national identity being eroded, right, by markets. Right? So, and sometimes it's simply just aesthetic objections, right, to change or something like that. Again, talking about my township. So recently, we have it's a mix of suburban development and farmland, right? So we have this agricultural history. And there's a farm that's basically right next to my neighborhood, which a developer was looking at buying and then putting in some development that's slightly higher density than you find in most of our township. And naturally, like, my neighbors all go ballistic. Like, how can we possibly do this? This is terrible. We're going to have so much traffic on this road, or whatever it happens to be. All these objections. And then you see people start raising ideas like, well, maybe we should do like the township over. And any new development, if you're going to build a single-family home, it has to have 3 acres of land around it. Just this enormous amount of property, which, like, if that regulation had been put in place, say, 75 years ago, like, there would be basically no development at all, right, in my township. I don't have 3 acres of land. I have like a ½ acre, and that's fairly common. If anything, that might be slightly on the larger than average size. Right? So what is it? It's this objection to, oh no, I like driving past the cornfields and the cows. Right? I don't want that to change. Right? So we need to have, right, in this case, our zoning regulations change so we prevent, right, this type of thing from happening. So we see these types of objections, or sometimes it is a specific aesthetic goal. Like I mentioned before, things like, well, we don't want homes that are too small. It's not that a 600-foot home, a square-foot home is dangerous or something like that. We just don't want that to happen. Oddly enough, then you see people complaining about how, oh, well, my kids can't find any good starter homes in the area. Well, yes, you set a minimum size for the home and then a minimum lot size. They can't possibly afford this. But nonetheless, right, this is the type of thing that we see happening because people don't like what they imagine the market outcome will be, or what even proposed market outcomes are going to be. So we need the state, right, to intervene and prevent these outcomes. Okay. So I think it's very common for us to find interventionism both in practice and also as advocated by the public and also by professional economists for the most part. So let's then look at Mises's arguments against interventionism. Now here I'm drawing from two specific works. One is his 1940 book, Interventionism and Economic Analysis, which, if you know Mises's personal history, 1940 was right around the time he's having to flee Austria to get out of the way of the Nazis. I don't know for sure when he wrote this book, whether it was while he was fleeing, right before he fled, or right after he fled, but he is certainly not particularly a fan of the National Socialists. I'll just put it that way. So he had reason to flee, as far as that goes. And I'm also drawing from a 1950 essay that he wrote called The Middle of the Road Leads to Socialism. So let's take a look at what he has really two main arguments that I want to talk about here, which we'll demonstrate through an example. So his first major claim, right, is that interventionism is self-defeating. That is to say, it's unable to achieve its own stated goals. Right, so here, Mises very much believed in the idea that as economists, right, we should be value-free. Right, so when we're evaluating whether a policy is good or bad, we need to evaluate it on the basis of the goals that are stated by the people that are advocating the policy. Right, so if you advocate that this particular policy is going to achieve this goal, and it doesn't, then it's obviously a bad policy even by your own standards. Now, his second main claim, right, is that interventionism is unstable. As his title says, right, the middle of the road leads to socialism. That is, we won't just be able to hang on in this world where the state is only intervening here and there. Rather, we're going to be led down a path of total state control. So the example that he gives in his 1950 essay is, suppose that we develop this goal. We want to make sure that cheap milk is widely available to people. Right, so a simple way that we could do this, right, the government steps in and says, well, we're going to put in place price ceilings on milk. Right, so previously we're charging, say, $3 a gallon. Well, now $2 a gallon is all that's allowed. Right, so what is the problem? Well, the problem is once you lower the price of milk, then we're going to have some of those marginal producers that it's just barely worthwhile for them to produce milk find it's no longer worthwhile once the price is forced down, so they abandon milk production. So they might do things like, typically when you cull your dairy herds, you process them into beef, sell that, and then you don't have them anymore. Right? So that is what we would expect to see happen. What those marginal milk producers, where it's just barely worthwhile for them to produce at $3, it's not worthwhile at $2, they leave the market. Which means now milk is less available than before, right? So this is the proof that Mises gives of that first claim, right? That is, interventionism was self-defeating. We wanted to make cheap milk widely available. Milk is now less available than it previously was, right? So clearly it was not the right path to achieve this goal. Okay, so claim number one, proven. Okay. What about claim number two, this idea that interventionism is leading us down this path, right, toward socialism? Well, the first thing to be clear about, one piece of criticism that started falling upon Mises and then also upon Hayek with his Road to Serfdom is that people misunderstood why they were writing about this and thought that they were making almost like this Marxian prediction. This is inevitable. Right? So once we start down this path, we're going to end up socialist. It's just a matter of time. Right? That's all it is. When in fact, Hayek is very clear about this, and Mises as well in his 1950 essay. The whole reason we're talking about this is so we can reverse course. It's not inevitable, but rather that we're just putting us on the wrong path. That's it. So one option then would be that we do reverse course. Right? So take that price ceiling, put it in place, milk is less available than before. It is in fact theoretically possible, right, for the authorities to say, oops, that may not have been the best idea. Let's undo that and at least get back to where we were. Now, this idea that we can undo it and then just get back to where we were is probably not true. After all, if you've already slaughtered your herd, you can't just start milking them again. Right? As far as I know, right, steak does not produce much milk. Right? Instead, we have to raise new cattle, and it turns out that's a lengthy process. It takes, I was looking this up yesterday just so I could talk about this. It takes about 2 years, right, from the birth of a dairy calf to the point where you can actually start milking it, and then its peak production doesn't come for another couple years after that, right? So it's a long process to fix the mistake. Right? Even when we realize that's a mistake and reverse course, we have created this disruption that's going to last a couple years. Now, depending on the specific market, the length of time to get back to where we were, if that's even possible, but at least to eliminate the specific problem, is going to vary. So things like, if you say cull chicken herds, chickens can be raised from hatching to where they lay eggs in about 6 months, right? So it's a bit shorter than for cattle. On the other hand, my father-in-law had an apple orchard. Apple trees, it takes roughly 5 years, maybe a little bit more, right, from a seedling to where they actually start producing apples. So you could have potentially very, very long periods of time where you're having to deal with less production than you had before, depending on the specifics of the case. But at the very least, we could reverse course, and then we still have to deal with the problems created in the meantime, but at least we are on the right path. But what Mises thinks is more likely is that as long as we adopt the interventionist philosophy, that is, that it is the state's job to fix problems, now we have this problem that has been created as a bunch of milk producers left. Well, the state needs to step in and fix this problem. So how do we do it? Well, one option, which is what Mises mentions, right, is that, okay, the reason that these marginal producers left, right, wasn't just that the price of milk was too low. Right, it was the price of milk was too low relative to the costs of production. Right, so what we need to do then is step in with those costs of production, push those down. Right? So we start regulating the price of milking machines, the price of dairy cattle, perhaps even the wages of dairy farm workers, right, to make sure that the wages stay down, the costs stay down, whatever those costs happen to be. So then there is still, right, enough of a margin between the cost and the price at which you can sell that it's worthwhile to stay in business. Of course, all this does is push the problem back another step, right? So now all of those all of those companies that were making, say, milking machines, now they're having problems. Those that were on the margin, it was just worthwhile, stop producing their milking machines. We don't have enough of those. So now we need to look at all of their costs of production and start regulating those as well. And here we see the argument for why interventionism would lead us down the path towards socialism. As step by step, one price after another gets determined by the government, and the government may even also step in with regulation of production levels. This is also another path, often in combination, they would use these two things. So where we end up then, if we continue down that path of regulating one thing after another in terms of its price and production, we end up with what Mises calls a German style of socialism. So unlike the Russian style, in the Russian style, the Soviet style of socialism, the government claims ownership over everything and then directs it bureaucratically. Under the German style of socialism, the claim is that, yes, you still legally own your dairy farm. You own all of these cattle, you own all of these milking machines, what have you, but the state tells you what to do with it. Right? So this is why, if you read Ludwig von Mises' Socialism, the book that he wrote, the first chapter, it's an extensive chapter, is about the concept of ownership and what that means. Right? And the point that he makes is that as far as economists are concerned, right, it's not legal title that matters. What matters is the decision-making side. Right? So if we're in a world where all of these economic decisions are ultimately directed by the state, one will is prevailing, right? Even if I technically hold title, right, to my dairy farm, it really doesn't matter if I make no decisions related to it. We're in socialism. And so that's where the middle of the road leads to socialism, according to Mises' argument. Now, I want to make a couple other kind of side observations from Mises, and specifically his 1940 book about interventionism and economic analysis. Right, so another point that he makes is that interventionism has this tendency to corrupt, right, democratic governments, particularly representative democratic governments. And so Mises, very much unlike, say, a Hoppe, speaks of democracy much more positively. Now, Ryan McMakin has a pretty good essay, that I forget when he wrote this, where what Mises means by democracy is clearly not just pure majority rule. Right? He has kind of a more subtle concept in mind. Nonetheless, he does speak of this as a positive thing. Right? So in Mises' view, as he describes this in his Interventionism book, right, he says that a representative, a parliamentary democracy, can only work, right, insofar as the representatives are each trying to represent what is best for the people as a whole. Now, it might be there will still be debates because we debate about what is best for the people as a whole, but we're at least trying to represent everybody in the process. So we don't have specific constituencies that we're trying to satisfy. We're trying to satisfy what is best for the whole. However, interventions by their very nature are going to create winners and losers. Right? So if we go back to something like that price control on milk, now, there are going to be some people that are actually benefited from it, those that can still get milk and now get it more cheaply. As a buyer of milk, a frequent buyer of milk, I have 4 kids. Only one of them drinks water, and the rest drink milk. We go through like a gallon a day. It's an enormous amount of milk flows through my kitchen. Right? So paying $1 less per gallon, that looks pretty attractive. As long as I can find it, I am in fact made better off if the price falls. On the other hand, we have the milk producers. If they're still in business, they're making less than before. They're certainly losers. We have those consumers that would have been able to find milk at $3 a gallon, but can't at $2 a gallon because less is available. They're made worse off. So we have these groups of winners, these groups of losers. Every time we intervene, you will see winners and losers arise. Right? That then gives rise to special interests. And what we see happen then in this representative system is representatives stop representing the entirety of the population and start representing the specific special interests from wherever they happen to be elected. And this then leads to the downfall of the overall democratic system, as we just have special interests warring over what is going to happen to policy, and this leads to more and more interventionism as each special interest wants its own beneficial intervention put in place. A second observation that Mises makes is he tries to get at the root of what is it that leads to this interventionist mindset. Right? And he attributes it to what he calls daydreamers. When I was practicing this talk, and my wife was in the hotel room, when I said this, she gets all offended. Because she was definitely like one of those kids that spent time daydreaming, doodling, and the like. Okay, oh, it's my fault that we're on the road to socialism. No, here's specifically what he means. Right? He says that we come into life, right, with things we would like to achieve. But the reality is that a lot of what life is figuring out how to accommodate, right, ourselves to the fact that we live in a society where we can't necessarily get everything we want. Right? So he suggests there are people that psychologically have difficulty with the fact that they have to face reality and they don't get everything they want, right? So they end up living in these daydreams, fantasizing about, boy, if I ruled the world, right? Every day would be the first day of spring. Everyone would have a new song to sing, all of this kind of stuff, if I ruled the world. So what does this lead to? Right? This leads then to people being very attracted, right, to the potential rulers that promise them a world that looks like the one that they want to live in. Right? So if I have the instinct of saying there ought to be a law, I get very attracted to the people who say, well, I will make that particular law, and we end up with these people being placed in power. Okay. Now, I want to suggest, remember Mises was writing this in 1940, if we have such daydreamers today, I'm going to suggest a much less destructive alternative. City skylines exists. If you want to try your hand at central planning, there are plenty of games that will let you do that in all kinds of environments. Where the city is too small, Sid Meier has the civilization track. Right? I've spent more than enough time doing this, so anytime I get the itch of, gee, I'd really like to rule over a civilization, open up my computer, spend a couple hours there, and I haven't destroyed anybody's lives that way. Right? Or perhaps if I want to destroy individual people's lives, we have the Sims series of games available to you. Right? So you can do this as well, and you're not actually hurting any actual people. Okay, so maybe what we need to start thinking about is redirecting people to have you spent enough time playing games? All right, in any case. And so this was really Mises' main argument, remember, first, that interventionism is self-defeating, it cannot achieve its stated goals, and because of that, it will be unstable, move us down the path toward socialism as long as we don't give up, right, on the interventionist mindset. So what does Rothbard then contribute? Right, so Rothbard contributes a classification scheme. So one thing that is interesting about Mises' analysis, he wrote about interventionism through many times in his career, and that he very much had this idea that interventions themselves were really kind of piecemeal. So there's kind of these one-off ways that we are intervening. Well, we want the price control in milk. Maybe we'll control rents. Maybe we'll try to set minimum wages, these kinds of things. Right? Maybe we'll have confiscatory taxes here or there, right? These types of things. And he really didn't treat these interventions in kind of a systematic way, because I don't think that he believed it was a system. It was instead kind of an instinct. Now what Rothbard provides for us, though, is a much more systematic classification scheme. And you find this in both Man, Economy, and State, and also Power and Market. It's that last chapter of Man, Economy, and State, which was really kind of a summary of Power and Market that he had to stick on there since the whole volume would have been too large originally. At least, as I understand, that's what the publisher thought. Now we have them both together in one volume. It turns out you can't add pages. We've made that technological development in the past 50 years. So what are the three types of intervention that Rothbard suggests? The first is what he calls autistic intervention. Right, so this is intervention that only involves the subject of the intervention themselves. Right? So he gives the example of something like requiring somebody to say a pledge. Right? So here you're not giving resources to somebody else, so there's really nobody else involved, it's just that you yourself would have to say this pledge. Now, thinking about local stuff as I do, and as I've mentioned before, while I've talked about the zoning regulations, both real and proposed in my township, I am glad that I don't live in the city that is just west of me, because it seems like there, the major qualification for running for city council is that you think your homeowner association rules really need to apply citywide, right? So if only the whole city had to abide by these rules. So they have proposals for things like you're not allowed to park your pickup truck in your own driveway. This would be an autistic regulation, right? So it's your own pickup truck, your own driveway. Are you allowed to park it there or not, right? So it's autistic regulation. The second type of regulation would be a binary regulation, which you can tell from the name involves two parties. This would be where the state compels an exchange or a gift, right, between the subject and the intervener. The most obvious case here would be something like taxation, right? So because I earn an income, I also have to pay payroll taxes that then go to the state, or every time I buy something, as long as it's something that is under the sales tax system, I have to pay the sales tax. That money goes to the state as well. So this is an exchange or a gift, voluntary or not, in this case not voluntary, going to the intervener from the subject. Okay. Then the third type of regulation is a triangular regulation. So this is one, you can tell from the name, would involve three parties. So this is where there would be an exchange or would not be an exchange between two other parties. The state then gets involved and either compels an exchange that would not have happened, right? So something like a requirement to buy auto insurance, that kind of thing is very, very common. Many states require this. Or preventing an exchange from happening, right? So we can really think of something like a minimum wage as doing this, right? So I could imagine a case where, say I find, 13-year-old neighbor, say, hey, I'd like you to come help me clean my house. Just do a little bit of the work with me. I'll pay you $4 an hour or something like that. The 13-year-old can't really get much better work. It's convenient, right, that kind of thing. As long as we agree to it, this is perfectly fine, mutually advantageous. But nonetheless, the state steps in and says, oh, no. This isn't allowed for a couple of reasons. One, child labor. Two, minimum wages. This is not going to fly. Right, so we're preventing an exchange that otherwise would have happened. Right, so the state, being the third party, is intervening in some kind of relationship, an exchange, right, between two other parties. So what this classification scheme gains for us is that it allows Rothbard to be very good at coming up with, well, how do winners and losers work in a much more general way, right? Rather than having to say, let's look at the specific price regulation for milk, who gains and who loses, we can look at each of these general categories and reach some conclusions about who will win and who will lose. So first, in terms of losers, here it actually doesn't matter which of the interventions we're talking about. The targets of the intervention, someone there is going to lose. Right? The reason being, we know that all action is, at least ex ante, value maximizing. I'm doing the thing that I most value doing. Right? So if I am being forced to change what I am doing from what I otherwise would have done, right, I'm forced to do something that I would not want to prefer, that I would not prefer. So I'm certainly made worse off. So if I happen to be one of those criminals that would want to park my pickup truck in my driveway, it might be because I have other things I want to use my garage for. Maybe it's a workout space, maybe it's storage, maybe I have two other cars that I want to have in the garage because I don't care so much about the pickup. It can be out in the weather, but I want to keep my other two cars nice. Once we put in place that autistic regulation that no, the pickup truck cannot be parked in your driveway, now I have to change how I use my garage. I'm being made worse off. I have to pursue a different line than I otherwise would have done, and one that I less prefer. This is also true with binary regulation, any kind of binary intervention as well, right? I had something else that I could have done, right, with that money that was taken in the form of taxes, or with triangular interventions, we had a mutually beneficial exchange arranged, it was not allowed to occur, therefore we are made worse off. Right, now, who's the winner then? Well, it turns out the intervener is who wins. Right? So it is, in fact, the state itself who wins. And sometimes they're cronies as well in certain cases, but at the very least, we know the intervener is going to be a winner amongst whoever happens to win. Right? Now, this is most obvious in the case of a binary intervention. So if you take my money, then you have more money than before. Right? So the state has more command over resources whenever it taxes. So it is directly and materially benefited from any kind of binary intervention. At the same time, with autistic and triangular interventions, it's not so obvious what the gain is. Right? But here, Rothbard is very clear that, well, psychological profit exists. Right? So why is it that this neighboring city's council is talking about saying, no, you can't park pickup trucks in your driveway? Well, it's just something that they don't like seeing all those pickup trucks in these driveways. Right? If they don't have to see them anymore, they will feel better. Right? So they get this psychological profit, right, from this autistic intervention. Similarly, triangular interventions. Right? I feel better, right, knowing that, oh, there aren't people out there being oppressed by low wages. We've prevented that thanks to the minimum wage, being, of course, the mindset of the intervener. Now, I want to point out here a clear contrast, right, from Mises. Right? First is that in Rothbard, he tends to place far less emphasis on what we might call the dynamics of interventionism, on this idea that interventionism tends to lead toward the road to socialism. You don't see that nearly as much in Rothbard's discussion. Another thing is that, and I think that my previous discussion makes this clear, is he places much more emphasis on the fact that it's the intervener that gets benefits from intervention. You don't see that quite as much in Mises. Mises acknowledges winners and losers, but at the same time, he's not always as clear that the intervener is a winner. Right? Whereas that's very, very clear in a main point that Rothbard makes. Now, this naturally may then have some explanatory power in why intervention happens, perhaps. So let's move then to some of the more modern developments, some things that have been happening over, say, the past 10 years regarding this. So I want to start with Sanford Ikeda and what he calls the Misesian paradox. Right? And that is that time has passed since 1950. And what we have seen, right, is that this middle-of-the-road policy that's supposed to be unstable and supposed to lead us either to abandon it and go back to unhampered markets or down the road to socialism, so we end up living under socialist systems, nonetheless, that doesn't seem to be what has happened over the past 60, 75 years. Right? Instead, it seems like we've been pushing more and more toward the middle of the road. Right? Those governments that were generally more socialist have often become less so over time, but at the same time not fully embracing free markets. Those that were generally more free market seem to have become less so over time, right? Moving in the direction of more intervention. So it seems like interventionism, rather than pushing systems away from it toward one of the pure systems, it's doing exactly the opposite. It's drawing systems toward it. So why is this happening? Right? This is exactly the opposite of what Mises would suggest. So Sanford Ikeda suggests that there are actually two different potential dynamics. One of those is what he calls regulatory dynamics. So regulatory dynamics are what happens when a state tries to get involved with the relative pricing of a goods, like a price control would be one example of that. And Ikeda suggests that these types of interventions do actually act the way that Mises suggests. That is, they will create problems which would then lead to more and more intervention unless we reverse course. However, he suggests there's a second type of intervention that is relevant and, in fact, might have some level of stability. Right? This is what he calls transfer dynamics. Right, so one thing, Mises does talk about there being winners and losers. He did that in his analysis of the impacts on democracy. Right? So that raises then the possibility, Ikeda suggests, that, well, maybe the transfer is the point. Right? If what I want to do is create a winner and a loser, try to transfer wealth from one party to another, then it hasn't been self-defeating. Yeah, I made people poor on the whole, but nonetheless, it's not been self-defeating. There's no reason for us to try to fix the problem because we didn't actually create a problem in our own mind. And so this could lead to some level of stability. Now, interestingly, I think that when you read Mises carefully in his 1940 book, right, he actually seems to take a similar idea, and you could very easily extend what he says to Ikeda's point. So here's what Mises says. So we know that he concedes, right, that if the goal is to transfer rather than overall prosperity, interventions can actually achieve those goals. So that being the case, this might actually affirm Ikeda's hypothesis. So here's what Mises says about protective tariffs in particular. He says, these restrictive measures are comparatively harmless. They reduce productivity, they make people poorer, but they permit the process to continue to function. The market can adjust to isolated restrictive measures. So this doesn't sound like, oh, now we're on this path to socialism where we have to keep doing one thing after another to fix it. Then he says, the effects are different in the case of measures designed to fix prices, wages, and interest rates at points different than what they would be in the unhampered market. Right? So Mises himself recognizes there's a difference between something like a tariff, which is specifically designed to benefit one party at the expense of another, and then things where we're trying to fix a market by changing what the prices, wages, or interest rates would be like. Right? So what does he say there? Well, he says things are different than things are different in that case. He also says that if they are measures which intend the elimination of profits, right, then they paralyze the working of the market economy. Right? So I think it is not too much of a stretch, right, to say that reading Mises here, it sounds like as long as we stick to these transfer policies, we're not necessarily hopping on the road, right, to socialism. Rather, we have that problem once we start messing with prices, wages, interest rates, profits. Okay. Right. So I'll just say he seems to affirm the idea the market can handle, right, certain types of interventions, at least to some degree, right, so long as prices are kept flexible and profits are tolerated. Now, I think it's fair to say that if you look at economic history since World War II, with only a few exceptions, the minimum wage being the primary one, economists have generally been pretty successful at eating away at things like price controls. So this is something where like Austrians and most mainstream economists seem to agree that price controls are generally destructive, and we have actually been reasonably successful at getting rid of most price controls around the world. Right? So that being the case, that means we're getting rid of those things that would put us down the path to socialism, could help to explain why it is that we seem to have stabilized in some kind of interventionist economy. Okay. All right. And I think it's also true that we now live in a world also, when we think about the taxation away of profits, international capital mobility, the fact that investors can invest virtually anywhere in the world places limits on how much you can try to confiscate profits away from investors. Well, just invest somewhere else, right, if your corporate tax rate gets too high. Right, so Robert Higgs then, this was in a volume that Aikida put together. He had an essay that he put in. I think actually goes a step further than what Aikida does. So I don't think Higgs uses this phrase, but I think it's probably fair in describing the point that he's making. Right? And that Higgs suggests, right, that in fact we have what I'm going to call an interventionist stability hypothesis that gets presented, where he says that Mises's argument is really missing a couple historical elements, right, things that have happened since 1940 that are applicable in the modern world that were not so applicable back then. Right, so there are two things that have happened. Right? The first is the spectacular failure of the socialist economies. This was something Mises didn't actually get to witness, the total downfall of the Soviet Union, for example. And what that has done in terms of people's perspectives is that while we kind of may like the idea of socialism in some cases, we have seen what happens when we try to adopt it. Right? So we know the closer we get, right, to something like a pure socialism, the further we get from any kind of workable system that breeds an acceptable level of well-being. Right? So as a result, there's only a really small handful of people that are actually advocating full socialism. So like you look in the United States, right, the people that call themselves socialists, you say, okay, what do you mean? Right? They almost never mean the government should run all of the economy. Instead, they mean things like, well, I think we need more welfare. I think that taxes on rich people should be higher. Right? Maybe we need a wealth tax, right? That kind of thing. So they really just have in mind more intervention than we have now. They really don't have in mind an actual takeover of the economy, one will prevailing as the economy is running. Right? So I think that real socialism, it's extremely difficult to find actual advocates of this, at least in large numbers. Right? Secondly, the second element being that there is this discomfort with unhampered free markets that nonetheless remains. I've mentioned this before at the beginning. There are certain elements of things we imagine markets will create that people just don't feel comfortable with. We don't like the inequality. We don't like the erosion of national identity. We don't like whatever it happens to be. Right? So we're not really willing to accept, right, pure market outcomes. So what do we need? We need markets, but regulated. Now, the way that Higgs describes this, Higgs says, well, we know that the market process is a process of creative destruction. He uses this phrase he gets from Joseph Schumpeter. So as innovation happens, that makes some things obsolete. Right? And people get very uncomfortable with the fact that the thing they're producing might end up obsolete. Right? So we end up, say in the US, people crying about the fact that we just don't have as much manufacturing as we had before. Right? Now, you see very few of these people trying to seek out manufacturing jobs, but nonetheless, we don't like the idea that this destruction has happened as the economy has developed. We've moved away from that. And so because we don't like the destruction part of creative destruction, we need to intervene, right, in the market process, right, to result in more socially acceptable outcomes. So in this ideological environment, Higgs suggests, right, the state recognizes these facts, right? Recognizes also that it is, in effect, right, a parasite, right? That it is drawing resources away from, right, the private sector, and that the only way that it can continue to do so is it doesn't kill the host. Right? A parasite that kills the host doesn't last very long, right? So what do? We know that the host, right, is the market economy. We give it enough freedom, right, that it can go ahead and prosper, and then that means, right, that the leeches can also prosper as well. The way that Higgs says this, he says, most people want creature comforts, ceaseless entertainment, and the illusion of state-provided security, both against foreign devils and against economic and health-related vagaries. And the interventionist state has shown it can give that, at least enough of these things, right, to placate them, while enriching the rent seekers and the opportunists, right, with undreamed of wealth at public expense. Meanwhile, the system leaves private enterprise enough room to maneuver for them to innovate, invest, and thereby elevate the general standard of living. Such a system, though lamentable on many grounds, is plenty sustainable. Indeed, this is what Higgs says, under current ideological and political conditions, it is impossible for me to imagine how any alternative politico-economic order stands much chance as a competitor. If you've never met Robert Higgs, he's a very optimistic guy. If you have met Robert Higgs, you know that was a total lie. He's not particularly optimistic as far as that goes, right? But nonetheless, I think within this, me being actually a more optimistic person, I think he hints at, right, a potential solution. Because after all, what does he say? He says, right, under current ideological and political conditions, it is impossible for me to imagine da-da-da, right? Well, what then do we need to change, right? The ideological conditions. And in fact, Mises himself suggests something very similar. When you look at his middle of the road leads to socialism, the ending paragraph of it is fantastic and definitely answers what Higgs is saying. And he says what we need, right, is neither anti-socialism nor anti-communism, but an open, positive endorsement of that system to which we owe all the wealth that distinguishes our age from the comparatively poorer conditions of ages gone by. And I dare say, I think that's what Mises University is all about. Thank you. It might be time for like one question, something like that. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I talked faster than I expected, sorry. Or if not, we have an 18-minute break. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Professor. One question per person. Do not grab the microphone. No monologues, questions only.
Good morning, Professor. Would you say that Mises in general accepts like a philosophy theory of history, that it is like the beliefs of the people of the time that drive society forward?
Yes. Yeah, I think that like, he would definitely take the view that in the long run there is no unpopular policy, right? That either, right, we develop a system where we change people's philosophies to adopt what is happening, right, or the opposite happens, people's philosophies change, and then the system has to adopt that. I think that is very accurate to his view.
On the nuance of interventions, you talked about, binary intervention, triangular intervention, stuff like that. With certain things like, for example, like autistic interventions, do you believe there's some sort of nuance there between maybe interventions that are like somewhat autistic versus nuances that are extremely autistic, something like that?
Okay, can you give me an example of kind of each direction and what you have in mind?
I was asking something in regards to like, maybe something that only affects you a little bit versus something that affects you a lot. Is there anything?
Oh, right. Okay, yes. So, okay, yes. Yeah. So like here we could have, say, like I think both of them would be considered an autistic intervention. So something like, I don't know, like a seatbelt law, something like that, right? It doesn't take me that long to buckle my seatbelt. It's not going to make it does not ruin my life, right? That kind of thing. Similarly, like any regulation that most people would have done anyway, right? Okay, so in that case, it's going to have very little impact because most people would have done this anyway, right? So I think about, say, there are some places where, now normally speed limits are set too low. Some places they're set too high, right? And so people just, like the conditions of the road don't allow you to drive at the speed limit, right? So in this case, there's gonna be very little impact, right? So I think it's certainly possible that there may be some interventions where they just don't have much impact because people are going to either operate close to them or not feel that put out by them. At the same time, there are others that might be much more impactful. That's absolutely the case. So I certainly wouldn't claim that every intervention is equally harmful.
All right, 15-minute break.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on environmental issues. This is one of those issues which I think people who are kind of in favor of free markets get a little weak on sometimes, because we think, well, maybe this is the area where we need some government intervention, because who's going to take care of the environment? And I'm hoping that I can shed some light on this and maybe help you see a little piece of this work that some Austrian economists have been doing on environmental issues. I'm going to focus here on environmental conservation. I may say a couple of words about pollution issues, but last year's talk was more on broader pollution control issues and those kinds of things. And I'll give you a QR code at the end that you can, if you go to that, then it'll take you to my page that's got my resources from last year as well. So I didn't want to overlap too much with last year. I wanted to do some new things on environmental conservation that I've been thinking about. But first, a kind of a preface, what is it that the mainstream says about markets and how do they relate to the environment? And of course, the threshold for government intervention is very, very low for most economists. And they will say, well, here's the problem with markets is that they fail. And they typically will say, okay, so there's the externality problem, which means that we've got these side effects of your behavior that adversely or positively affect somebody else. And the producer of that side effect is not really taking that impact into account when deciding how much of a good to produce. And so we get this kind of overproduction or underproduction argument centered on externalities. And this is really the framework behind a lot of mainstream treatment of pollution issues. That pollution is a negative effect of somebody's production. It's not like they're trying to hurt somebody else, but this is the side effect on bystanders. A second argument is that markets will underproduce public goods. And by public goods, the mainstream means not just goods that are produced by government, but goods that satisfy two characteristics. First of all, you can't exclude people who don't pay. There's no meaningful way to restrict use to those who are paying. And secondly, they will say it has to be non-rival, which means if one person consumes it, there's just as much left over for someone else. And the argument there is that this will lead to a free rider problem, where people decide to consume the good, but they don't contribute to its production. And so this is the basis for arguing that government should produce these public goods in order to supplement what markets will underproduce. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that argument here. I may touch on it when we get to some other issues later on. And then finally, there's the market power argument that governments are allegedly will have to intervene in order to deal with problems of monopoly. Of course, we know that government creates monopoly. I mentioned in a talk earlier this week the problem of patents, which are a government-created monopoly, and governments often engage in regulatory activity that restricts entry into an occupation or into an industry, and that creates this kind of problem with not being able to compete as you would on a free market. So the whole idea of market failure is that, well, there's this textbook ideal. Markets will be fully competitive, perfectly competitive. Everybody will have the same information. There will be no externality problem, and then markets don't actually live up to that textbook ideal. Therefore, we need to get government involved and correct for these kinds of things. I often point students to an article by Art Carden and Steve Horwitz, which, if you look up just Carden and Horwitz on externalities, and you'll probably find that article that's on, I think, econlib.org, on why it is that just because you've shown that the market failed, which I would say that by itself is a major problem, but even if you could show that, you would not be able to conclude that government should then intervene. There are too many other problems, and so I'd point you to that as a useful way of thinking about it. So even if you were able to show that the market failed, how do you know that the government's approach to the problem would be superior. And this is a very serious problem. So I want to go through several issues here and spend a lot of time here on central planning and conservation. That's a resource use question. We've got a lot of land in the United States that is under central planning effectively. And of course, coasts and ocean out to the whatever the legal limit is that nation states have this kind of control over oceans as well. And so especially if you look at the western United States, the majority, sometimes the vast majority of the land is actually under government control of one sort or another. This map that you see is only federal lands and Indian reservations in the United States. This does not include state land or municipal land. And even a lot of the private land is under various regulations that restrict the degrees of freedom that the owners have to operate. So, for example, Alaska is 91.2% federal and state land. Nevada is 85% federal and state land. And some of this is like BLM land, Bureau of Land Management. Some of this is military reservations, military bases. Some of this is national forests and so forth, state forests and the like. Now that is much more the case in the West, but also some eastern states like New York that you see here on this list is 37% federal and state land. Well, now some people celebrate this and they say, well, you know, the more land is in the hands of the government, the better. And a former colleague of mine, now retired from my institution back in South Carolina, took some students on a tour of coastal South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina. And he said, he wrote this up in an article, and he said, it's a bad idea to turn the whole future of a region over only to people with money to make. Like, this is going to result in a land use catastrophe of some kind, and that this is going to mean just strip malls and apartment buildings and cookie cutter houses, and there's not going to be any nature left if we just turn this over to people who are interested in making money. Well, there's a lot of assumptions in here. I mean, in the argument that we need to have these government lands set aside to conserve the land, there's the assumption that government knows what use of that land is best, and that it can decide whether this land ought to be used as wildlife habitat or forest, or a lot of this government land is leased out to people who graze their livestock on the land, or they cut the trees down on the land. And so government land is often used for resource extraction. It's also used for recreational purposes. It's not just land that's set aside as some sort of untouched wilderness. It is most often being used for various purposes. How do we know what use and how intense of a use is appropriate? Will government actually bring us closer to what we want to see? And of course, who's we? And what is that objective? And of course, we've all got our own objectives about what we'd like to see what we would like to see happen with land. Ironically, even if you're looking at this from a kind of a stereotypical environmentalist perspective, you're going to see government land being used in ways that is not very conducive to preserving wilderness, if that's really your objective. And in some cases, we see governments using land in ways that are very destructive of environmental quality. So how do we know what is the optimal use? How do we know that land is best used as wildlife habitat, or for extracting trees for lumber, or used for housing, or used for some other purpose? Discovering this information is something that markets are really good at, because they can tap into those subjective preferences that individuals have and we see the result of that market process that produces a land use that is conducive to people's interests. Friedrich Hayek in 1979, in his book Law, Legislation, and Liberty, said that this welfare economics, this method of trying to assess the best uses of property, which pretends, he said, to base its arguments on the interpersonal comparisons of utilities, lacks all scientific foundation. The fact that most of us believe that they can judge which of the several needs of two or more known persons are more important does not prove either that there is any objective basis for this, nor that we can form such a conception about people whom we do not know individually. The idea of basing coercive actions by government on such fantasies is clearly an absurdity. So we don't really, you ask each person, well, what do you think should happen with a given piece of property, like, say, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge on the Arctic coast of Alaska, which actually has a lot of oil underground, apparently. What should happen to that? You ask one person, they're going to say, well, it should be left for wildlife. It shouldn't be touched. And other people are going to say, well, it should be drilled. We should drill the land. And to make those kinds of assertions that you know best what's going to happen, what should happen to that land it's a naked assertion. You have no basis for making that kind of statement other than to say that, well, that's your preference. There's no way to compare utilities and to say this is the best. My suggestion for this land is the best. Without the market discovery process, how do we know? And in fact, we don't. I can't say, well, it should be drilled. I can't say it should be used for wildlife habitat. So what we can do is we can say, well, let's look at the institutional surroundings, the kind of market environment that could allow people to make efficient decisions. And then we can improve economic outcomes without trying to make these interpersonal utility comparisons, without me trying to say, well, my desire for oil is more important than your desire for wildlife, or vice versa. So let's think about development restrictions in particular. And this gets back to what my former colleague was arguing about the coastal Atlantic states, where we see development after development, strip malls and wider highways and so forth. And we know that people do value natural landscapes, and we also know that when people develop land, they often try to preserve these natural landscapes. For example, there's an island on the coast of South Carolina, Kiowa Island, where the developer said, well, we want to put houses on this property, on this island, but we also want to preserve some of the natural habitat because people like habitat. They're more willing to live in a place where they are looking across their road and they're seeing marsh, or salt marsh, or they're seeing palm trees or deer walking by. They're not seeing a strip mall. And people are willing to pay more for that kind of amenity. But that does tend to be expensive because it means foregoing some of the alternative uses of the land. So there's this trade-off between giving people access to land by giving them houses that are closer to, say, the beach, and having that land be affordable. If you prescribe this kind of low-density development along the coast, then that means not many people are going to be able to afford to live there. So if you prohibit development, as many people are inclined to do, especially in fast-growing areas, they start to appeal to government to create these kinds of green zones or limitations on development of one sort or another. That will reduce the supply available for housing and for other things that people want and increase the price. So housing availability goes down, the cost of visiting the beach goes up, the cost of visiting a wilderness area goes up. Desirable land becomes even more inaccessible unless you're, of course, very wealthy. So I've got an article in the works for Mises.org on the history of land conservation by the government. And one of the things that we see is a kind of an alliance between groups that want to see land conserved for wildlife or wilderness areas, and people who want to drive up property values. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Let's think about this in a kind of a supply and demand framework, and I'll ask you to bear with me as I go through a couple of supply and demand graphs here. So here we've got a coastal zone A, and I'll get to coastal zone B in a minute. But here is the supply and demand for this land in coastal zone A. And you'll notice I've got 1990 here as the year, so this is 35 years ago. Here's the quantity and the price of that land. And somebody comes along and says, well, we don't like how fast this area is being developed. We don't like the fact that there are all these houses and apartment buildings and strip malls and restaurants and everything else being built here, so we want to put restrictions on this. And let's suppose they're successful, and that puts a hard limit on how much land can be developed in that coastal zone. So no impact right away. As you can see, this point is still legal. It's not, there's no problem, there's no restriction here that's really having an impact yet. However, once economic prosperity increases and we get more people maybe moving into the area, this becomes a binding constraint. This becomes a problem for people who want to buy houses and build strip malls and enjoy all of the amenities that people can bring into this area through development. And that means that instead of the price simply going to PM 2030 here, we have now PG 2030, the government imposed price through this land restriction, through this development restriction. And so now the price is going to be a lot higher. It's going to be higher than it would have been had land been developed without these restrictions. Okay, so let's now look at coastal zone B. This is maybe a neighboring or adjacent coastal zone down the highway on the coast, and we have no restriction on this zone. And so ordinarily, without the restriction in coastal zone A, we would have seen the price of the land go up as demand increases, as you have more population growth and affluence and so forth. However, because coastal zone A was kind of locked down and restricted because of the animosity toward development, now that means that people are going to flee to the neighboring area, coastal zone B. The demand for coastal zone B will rise, and therefore the price of land in that neighboring zone will also rise. And this, by the way, should give you a clue as to why some developers like to see development restrictions, as strange as that may seem, because if you're a developer who owns land or controls land in coastal zone B, you want that land neighboring yours to be locked off and prevented from having any kind of competing development. It means your land becomes more valuable. So the end result is we get higher prices everywhere. Ironically, some of the very same people who will say, we need to have green zones and we need to restrict development, we need to make sure that we have more land that's set aside as undeveloped, same people sometimes will complain that housing prices are too high. We need affordable housing. Well, why don't you have affordable housing? Well, because you prevented people from building housing. So this should not be terribly surprising that this is the result, but it is an inconsistency in how many people begin to think about this. We call this kind of phenomenon where land is developed in a kind of a sprawling manner, urban sprawl, where cities seem to expand outward rather than expanding upward in their central districts. And so some economists have suggested that we need to have some kind of zoning, maybe in these more rural or suburban areas, to try to prevent conversion of open space land. I was looking at a post on X by a state politician in South Carolina this week actually, where he was advocating for setting aside some big chunk of land as a green zone and so forth. And he's kind of a generally in favor of free markets, but he doesn't seem to see the inconsistency here, or maybe he's too persuaded by political pressures. But sometimes what you'll see is a state or maybe a city government will impose these land restrictions, development restrictions in a belt around a populated area. And so what we actually see happening as a result of some of these restrictions is that people move further out past the belt. They then get in their vehicles and they clog highways going back and forth, spending hours of their time every day from way outside the green zone where land is still affordable into the city where they work. And so you've simply extended commutes, cause them to buy more gasoline, cause them to put more miles in their cars, cause them to get into more car accidents and lose their lives sometimes on these highways because they're commuting because they were not allowed to live closer to work because of these restrictions. An example of this is Toronto, which over the years began to impose restrictions on more and more land outside of the immediate area of Toronto. And as a result, the neighboring communities outside the green zone began to expand. And in some cases, it seems that this is driving people out of the city rather than encouraging denser development into the city, which is what some of these planner types seem to have in mind. One law in LA County prevented undeveloped, non-contiguous areas from being zoned for urban densities and instead were zoned for low-density housing. So instead of apartment buildings, condos, et cetera, now you've got single-family dwellings. I have nothing against single-family dwellings. I live in one. I like my little quarter-acre lot. But at the same time, if we impose a restriction that says you can only have lot sizes of these dimensions or larger, or this square footage or larger, then you are limiting how many people can move into a certain area, and you're driving up house prices. So as a result of LA County's restrictions, what we saw happening is that people ended up going even further outside of the area that was being so controlled by these zoning restrictions. And so we got leapfrogging, where people were moving not just a little further out, but much further out. And again, those commuting distances increase with all the attendant problems from that. Let's move on here to federal land conservation. I'm going to give you some background here because I think this is interesting. I was reading through some of Rothbard's work on the Progressive Era, his book, The Progressive Era, which Patrick Newman edited, and it's enlightening. It was enlightening to me to see some of the background behind some of the early conservation efforts, and you think immediately of people like Theodore Roosevelt. And growing up, I thought, oh, well, that's kind of nice. We had some land set aside for national parks, and I'm kind of glad that it's a national park, and I wouldn't want to see a Hilton hotel on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I mean, there are hotels on the edge of the Grand Canyon, but I like wilderness. I like to go hiking. I visited a number of national parks, and so the instinct a lot of people have is that we need to have government set aside this land. Well, let's dig a little deeper in this. Some of the early players in this were Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Bureau of Forestry, which was a growing bureaucracy in the early 20th century, and of course Theodore Roosevelt, who got his face on Mount Rushmore, partly as a result of this preservation effort or conservation effort. And then, maybe more surprising, timber firms, railroads, and other industrialists wanted to see land locked up by the government and no development allowed on that land, or very little development allowed on the land. Now, you might say, well, why would an industrialist, and especially why would a timber company that makes money cutting down trees want the government to set aside land and regulate its use? Oh, and then we've got, of course, the ideologically motivated conservation advocates. You know, people who, they like trees, they like mountains, they like to see wilderness areas, and I like all of those things myself. And they just say, well, we want national parks because we like wilderness, or we want national forest land because we like wilderness. So Rothbard points out that the interests of these timber companies, the interests of some of these other firms were to drive up their own profits by shutting out their competition. Nothing wrong with making a profit, but when you're making a profit by getting the government to prevent your competition from emerging, we call that crony capitalism. All right, it's not really capitalism, it's a distortion of it. And we see this a lot with the early conservation movement. So the government basically said, we're going to keep this timberland out of commission. We're not going to allow it to be used freely. And so any privately owned timber suddenly increases in value. This is sort of like when Weyerhaeuser, a timber company, many years ago began to hire, on its own initiative, hire wildlife biologists to go onto land and look for an endangered species of owl. If they found any of these, then that would mean that the Fish and Wildlife Service would draw a big circle around the owl colony and say, you can't cut down any trees on this land. Now, why would a timber company want to go look for owls that would lock up timber? Well, they weren't looking for owls on their land. They were looking for owls on land that other timber companies could use, land that was government owned, that could be leased for use by these other companies. And so Weyerhaeuser ended up making profits because they were shutting out some of their competing resources and therefore driving up the value of their own. Now, I mentioned railroads earlier. This might be a little bit unclear. So the shaded areas here are the land grants given by the U.S. government to the transcontinental railroads in the latter half of the 1800s. Land grants were the main means of subsidizing these transcontinental railroads. They were given alternating blocks of land along their routes. And the railroads would then sell this land and make piles of money off of the sale of the land. And you can see that there is quite a bit of land that would be owned by the railroads. Now, if you're the railroad and you own all of this land, you want to be able to get the highest price possible for that. How do you do this? Well, you get the government to conserve other land that's not yours, so that when people do homestead land or they move out into these western areas and establish their ranch or homestead or farm or whatever, they're going to have to do this, or at least they're going to be more likely to do this on railroad-owned land and not this other land that the federal government has locked away. And so what we see is the national forests, the national parks, and other kinds of land set-asides were means to an end. And the end is, well, yes, to satisfy some of the Eastern ideologically motivated conservationist types, but also to satisfy the timber companies and the railroads. And of course, the U.S. Forest Service bureaucracy, which gets more jobs and a bigger budget because they've now got more land to manage. And so the government administrative state begins to expand, and it itself is a type of interest group that will seek to aggrandize itself at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer and a lot of other people. And of course, the politicians who are kind of brokering these deals where the conservationist ideologues get what they want, and the timber companies get what they want, and the railroads get what they want. And there was some pushback from people who were livestock owners who wanted ranch land and wanted grazing rights and so forth. We'll talk about grazing rights next, but this on the whole seems to have been the engine behind a lot of the so-called conservation efforts. And you can see the hypocrisy here, because some of the same groups who were saying, we need to conserve land, let's have a national forest over here, or let's have a national park over here, the same people were supporting initiatives or policies like tariffs on imported lumber. Now think about this for a minute. Who benefits from tariffs on imported lumber? Well, domestic lumber producers, right? So this helps the domestic lumber producers. Of course, if you want to build a house and you plan to use lumber for it, then that's going to cost you, but if you're the lumber company, you want this, right? If you have a tariff that prevents lumber from being brought in from another country, let's say Canada, are we going to see more trees or fewer trees cut down in the United States? More trees, right? You're preventing the import of lumber from other countries, and so now, of course, the timber is going to have to come from domestic sources more often, and so now you're going to cut down more trees. If you're really interested in preserving forests in their natural state, why would you want to support national forests for some sort of conservation purpose and at the same time support a policy that encourages the cutting down of more trees domestically? It's inconsistent. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it's lumbering. I'm not saying lumbering is morally offensive or anything like that. It's just these two things are not consistent unless the objective behind the national forest was to work toward the profits of the lumber companies. In addition, we see governments subsidizing development at the same time that they are engaging in these kind of pro-conservation efforts, like subsidizing irrigation on railroad land. So again, railroads are major beneficiaries from this. Also, we see land being put off limits to homesteaders, even if it is not locked up in a national forest or national park or other kind of government-owned land. The Reclamation Act of 1907 made land that might one day eventually be irrigated. Now you can't homestead that, locking up even more land. Earlier homesteading rules that had allowed, I think up to 320 acres to be homesteaded were repealed, and so now you can only homestead, I think, a maximum of maybe 120 acres. I don't know if my math is right on that. Anyway, so by restricting the amount of land that can be homesteaded, it is essentially making it uneconomical to homestead large chunks of Western land, because Western land tends to be dry. You're not going to have as much grass per acre for your livestock, and so if you're limited to only 160 acres, then you are not going to be able to make your ranch work. So the homesteading restrictions effectively locked up even more land as just not being economically viable for development. All right, so just a couple of comments here about the tragedy of the commons. Some of you may have seen this if you've taken an introductory economics class, at least I hope you have. And this is basically if you can imagine a pasture and in a village, and there are people that live around the pasture, and each one of them has maybe 2 or 3 or 4 cows, and they put the cows out to graze on this common pasture. If no one owns this pasture, then the pasture is likely to be overgrazed, because each person who's considering the benefits and the costs of putting a cow out to graze on the pasture is going to think, okay, well, I get all of the benefits of whatever grass my cow eats. I get none of the benefits of the grass my cow does not eat, that is eaten by some other person's cow. And so I get all of the benefits of my cow grazing. I suffer none of the costs, or a very small fraction of the costs of any overgrazing. That overgrazing is felt by everyone, and I'm only a small part of that. So this leads to a kind of an incentive problem where each person's going to put the cow out to graze, even if it means less overall productivity from that pasture. So, you could think of this as a kind of in a game theory setting here, where you have Rancher Al and Rancher Bob, and each of them have 2 cows, and they're trying to decide on each day, do I put one of my 2 cows out to graze that day, or both of them, or maybe I sell off a cow and I only keep one. If they both put 1 cow out to graze, they each get 5 pounds of weight gain per cow, per rancher rather. And so if Rancher Bob puts 1 cow out to graze and Rancher Al puts 2 cows out to graze, then Al gets 6 pounds of weight gain for his livestock. Bob gets only 3. And you'll notice that there's 10 total pounds here, there's only 9 here, and that is because with 3 cows grazing, there's not as much grass, it's not growing as fast, or not recovering as easily to allow weight gain for each rancher. If they both put 2 cows out to graze, then we wind up in this bottom right-hand cell here, where each person is getting 4 pounds of weight gain for their livestock total. So here's the tragedy, right? So if Rancher Al is thinking, okay, how many cows should I put out to graze? Well, if Bob is going to put 1 cow out to graze, then my choice is either I get 5 pounds or I get 6 pounds. I'll take 6, so that means I'll put 2 cows out to graze. If Rancher Bob is going to put 2 cows out to graze, then my choice is either get 3 pounds if I put 1 cow out myself, or 4 pounds if I put 2 cows out to graze. I'll take 4. 4 is better than 3. And of course, the math works the same way for Rancher Bob, who is thinking, okay, if Al is putting 1 cow out to graze, I can get 6 if I put 2 of mine out to graze as opposed to 5. So you see it's symmetric. So the incentive is for both ranchers to put both cows out to graze. The total amount of weight gain is 4 apiece instead of 5 apiece. They end up in a worse position than they would have if each of them had put only 1 cow out onto the pasture. So the key is nobody owns this land. That is why we call it a commons. And that is the reason it is going to produce this adverse result. There's overgrazing. If either Al or Bob or some third party were to own this commons, then that person would be able to get higher prices for leasing the grazing rights if they were to restrict the grazing to only 1 cow per rancher. But that kind of restriction is only possible if someone has ownership rights and therefore control over that pasture. Now, we've actually seen this happen in the American West. Now, I'll get into some of the details of this in a minute, but let me show you this picture, one of my favorite pictures that I show to students all the time. This is a border between 2 countries. On the left, you've got Haiti. On the right, you have the Dominican Republic. You'll notice that Haiti, the Haitian land is barren for the most part. The Dominican Republic land is heavily forested. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that Haiti is not as good at protecting property rights over land compared to the Dominican Republic. If you look at the economic freedom index of these 2 countries, Haiti has a very low rank at 103 last time this index registered Haiti, and then the Dominican Republic has has a much higher rank of 62. The protection of property rights rating, not a ranking, but a rating, is much higher for the Dominican Republic. Could be better, could be a lot better, but it is definitely higher than for Haiti, indicating that the Dominican Republic is more aggressive about protecting those property rights of landowners in that country. Well, in the American West, we saw a kind of a land communism where the tragedy of the commons was for a time able to take hold. Cattlemen wanted to see privatization of Western lands. They sought legal homesteading of cattle ranches. This was not agreed to by government, and so we ended up with a kind of a free-for-all, a commons of grazing land in the West. Range wars erupted between different owners of livestock, and public grazing land capacity fell by half in the last decade of the 1800s. No ownership means you get that tragedy of the commons. Samuel Hayes wrote that the public range rapidly deteriorated. Originally plentiful and lush, the forage supply was subjected to intense pressure by increasing use. The number of Western cattle grew rapidly after the Civil War. A rising sheep industry claimed its right to share in the public range, and settlers transformed grazing lands into more valuable cropland. And he goes on and basically says, look, the result of this is you end up with not only less grass, but you end up with more weeds instead of grass that's really useful for cattle and so on. Eventually, the government began to allow long-term leases for grazing, which is at least a step in the right direction. It reduced some of that tragedy of the commons, but the damage remained, and some people believe that the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, that drought that with the destruction of the topsoil, had to do with the grazing and the farming practices that were driven by the regulations on land and the land use that was dictated by government in the preceding decades. That land would have been had more healthy grass cover had it not been for these policies. Finally, and I don't have a lot of time left, just a couple of minutes here, but I wanted to mention a few things of more recent interest. I wrote an article that's on Mises.org about the wildfire that consumed the facilities at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I've been there twice, and it was, of course, distressing for me, especially having been there and visited on occasion, to see that these, the lodge, which dated back to the 1930s, had been destroyed, the visitor center burned down because of a wildfire. And so I suggest you take a look at that article. But one of the things I mention in that article is the bootleg fire of 2021 in Oregon burned more than 400,000 acres and provided a kind of a natural experiment in land management. So what you see here in this picture is 3 different types of land management. In the bottom of the picture, you have land that was thinned. That is, a lot of the underbrush was removed. You can see it's still burned. You can see, however, that the trees are still standing as opposed to the top of the picture where there was no treatment of the land at all. It was not subjected to a kind of a controlled burn. It was not thinned, and everything was just consumed in that fire. And yet, when that fire, which had topped out into the treetops, and you had these 200-foot flames, and it hit this middle section where there had been thinning and there had been controlled burns, and the trees you can see are still green. Why is this? Well, that land was privately owned. The other land, neighboring land, was not. So the neighboring land is the Fremont-Wanema National Forest, and the middle portion there is the Nature Conservancy's, one of the Nature Conservancy preserves, which they actively manage. So unlike the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy had actively managed their land, and as soon as that fire got to their land, it kind of ran out of fuel because the land had been carefully managed. So it's sort of, it's that picture, but it's this. I mean, it's like that meme. They're the same thing. So you've got, in one case, the property is well managed and it's privately owned. You don't get that same kind of bureaucratic procedure that's standing in the way of proper management. And in the other case, you've got, well, I am not going to be able to get to my property rights section, but if you go to my QR code here, you can go back to my 2024 lecture at Mises U, and I've got my slides from that lecture where I spent a lot more time talking about pollution issues. And of course, I've got to advertise a book that I contributed to here. I wrote a chapter for this. It's in the bookstore. If you're interested in climate issues, energy issues, so we talk about some of that in that book that came out last year. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions afterward here.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about ready to begin. Okay, economic inequality. Economic inequality is kind of really the issue of our times. I mean, there's a lot of single issues, but many of those single issues all come under the big tent of economic inequality. So there's poverty, there's the family, there's education, there's discrimination, there's, all sorts of job issues. There's all sorts of issues, but now in the modern context, they've all come under this big tent of economic inequality. The last couple of generations it's been sort of baked into their consciousness that economic inequality is the most important issue facing humanity. The other side of that coin, Thornton's side of that coin, is that really the case? Or is it really just kind of like a communist plot? As I see it, it's selected scholars, politicians, journalists, even Pope Francis, and the entire educational system in the West that has built in this sort of quasi-general communist ideology into our brains to be very, very suspicious of capitalists and entrepreneurs and always being really worried and concerned about the worker and relying on the politician. That's not, strictly speaking, dogma coming out of Karl Marx's Capitalism and the Communist Manifesto, but it's that sort of general background. And that's what I'm basically going to be here to debunk and to present the Austrian vision, which is really completely counter to that general vision that we have been experiencing. You've already seen and you've already learned bits and pieces of the Austrian perspective. Specifically in my class on the minimum wage law, we learned that in a free market, that the wages of labor are determined by the discounted marginal revenue product of labor. So there's a scientific explanation for wage rates, and competition drives and controls that wage rate. It's not, employers don't get to decide, workers don't get to decide, markets decide and regulate that whole process. You've also been exposed to the other categories of the other factors of production and their incomes. So you've learned that interest is very, very important. It's what capitalists earn from their efforts and what they do. They have a different time preference than the rest of us. They save money, they invest money in the economy, and that's really the primary ingredient to the productivity of labor, because they provide labor with all the great tools and facilities that makes them productive and drives up the wage rate. You've learned that the entrepreneur earns profits, and the inherent difficulties that the entrepreneur faces, even in a free market economy, more or less the interventionist economy that we have today, and that the entrepreneur does a lot of great things. Specifically, the entrepreneur is the uncertainty bearer. And most people don't like the idea of having to bear that uncertainty and having to manage the whole process. So you're making the decisions. A lot of people are averse to that. and they don't want to be in charge. They don't want to manage things. And that's what the entrepreneur, they take that burden, and then they end up paying labor for their effort before the product is even sold. So each of these groups or categories in the economy, they play productive, functional roles in the economy, and they're compensated. And in the free market, competition drives those compensations to sort of fair, equal levels. We've also learned about the role that government intervention plays here in income or economic inequality. I talked about the implications of that for the minimum wage, and you've also seen lectures that have touched on the Austrian business cycle theory and what that does to the economy in terms of distorting incomes in the economy. So you've already learned bits and pieces. And then, of course, we had the great lecture by Professor Wanjiro Najoya about race and discrimination, which really is a key ingredient in that communist plot. That, you know, it's the evildoer employers and entrepreneurs and capitalists that are taking advantage of people, whether it's minorities in specific cases or just taking advantage of labor in other cases. And then I want to, at the end, bust the general myth, really, that that the U.S. is the world's worst offender in all of these areas. That in the U.S., the income or economic inequality is greater than it is anywhere else in the world, and that in the U.S. that the government is held hostage and fails to tax these evil entrepreneurs and capitalists, and as a result, they're very, very stingy in terms of giving out benefits to the poor and the needy and the homeless and blah, 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 blah. That is a big myth, that the U.S. is somehow the worst offender, and that all of these enlightened socialist economies in Europe and Canada are much more forward-thinking and do a much better job and really are in touch with economic inequality. So Austrians love, or at least appreciate, economic inequality. What's it based on? What does it do for us? Instead of being the bane of human existence, it's actually a great strength, and it's just basically part of reality. Austrians recognize that individual humans are unique individuals. We're all different in many, many different ways. Tom Woods in the first lecture, pointed out that economics gets attacked for viewing us all as just little cogs in the machine, that, we're homo economicus, we're just little robots, we're all the same, we're interchangeable, blah, blah, blah. Austrians have a completely different perspective on human beings, that we're all individuals, that we're all unique, that we all have all sorts of differences, and exploiting those differences, you exploiting your talents, your interests, your abilities, and and knowing your deficiencies or building up your deficiencies is what makes you a productive contributing member and earns you a lot of income. So we love economic inequality. There are many types of equality and inequality, and many great thinkers and writers down through history have pointed out that totalitarians have used not just politics, but they've used language as a way of exploiting us, of gaining control over our lives, and then the politicians exploiting us. I think probably Orwell is a good example concerning that. And then, of course, socialists use coercion to solve our problems, in this case, solving the problem of economic inequality. The original socialists said that they could fix capitalism, they could make capitalism more efficient. That didn't work out, so they've switched gears to the new problems that in the post-communist world are economic inequality and the environment. Okay, and that's basically will start to reveal the distortions in that record. Ludwig von Mises in Human Action wrote, "Even those who look upon the inequality of wealth and incomes as a deplorable thing cannot deny that it makes for progressing capital accumulation, and is additional capital accumulation alone that brings about technological improvement, rising wage rates, and a higher standard of living." In other words, when we put that first, when we put capital accumulation first, it's something that rises up the entire economy and the entire human civilization, because we have more savings and then more capital, better tools, better facilities, better technology. Technology doesn't occur in a vacuum. It, of course, requires lots of capital. And you can look at what Mises said about a lot of different things in a book I edited called The Quotable Mises. There's several quotations of Mises on inequality, but also on things like fate and luck. So if you have any questions or concerns, this is a good place to get a taste of the real Ludwig von Mises. And it's not just a coffee table book. It's actually a good place to get started answering questions, whether that's a personal question or a little debate you're having, or you're doing research. If you want to know what Mises had to say about something, it's probably going to be in this book. And of course, the quotes are referenced for the books they come from, the page numbers, so you can go immediately with all of our free PDFs and find out the details on that particular subject matter. Now, taking a look at this issue of egalitarianism, the philosophy that thinks we should all be equal along many different vectors of human life, Murray Rothbard brings a libertarian, but also an economic and a very realistic perspective to this issue, and the anti-egalitarian perspective. He wrote that if men were like ants, there would be no interest in human freedom. If individual men, like ants, were uniform, interchangeable, and devoid of specific personality traits of their own, then who would care whether they were free or not? Who indeed would care if they lived or died? The glory of the human race is the uniqueness of each individual, the fact that every person, though similar in many ways to others, possesses a completely individuated personality of his own. It is the fact of each person's uniqueness, the fact that no two people can be wholly interchangeable, that makes each and every man irreplaceable, and that makes us care whether he lives or dies, whether he is happy or oppressed. And finally, it is the fact that these unique personalities need freedom for their full development that constitutes one of the major arguments for a free society. So again, that critique that Tom Woods brought to our attention in the first lecture about economics treating humans as robots is completely untrue. in the Austrian framework. Okay, in order to defeat the egalitarian call for economic equality, it's very important to know the different types of income classes, their different types of income and where they earn that income. And in this framework also note that these are categories and that individuals will actually be acting across some of these categories. So the most basic and most familiar category is labor. That's where we work, usually at an hourly wage, and we earn income from working. And the hourly wage is based on the marginal productivity of labor, which is based on the amount of capital accumulation. I use the term landlords here. It's the old-fashioned term from classical economics when they were talking about the people who owned the farmland and then later the people who rented out apartments and houses in the city. But this really applies to all property and resource owners. So land certainly is one of them. Buildings and structures is certainly a resource, but also things like minerals and oil and natural gas that are deep underneath the land. This class of owner earns rents, and that those rents are based on their ownership and their stewardship of those resources. Again, a very important neglected class in the economy, but these are the people who are responsible for resources that in some cases are depletable. Okay, so there's a certain amount of a particular mineral, let's say, copper in the world. It's relatively scarce. It's very important. Maybe our generation will just become copper hogs and want to use up all the copper that's in the earth. Well, one of the things that the resource owner does is it looks at the price of the product now versus the price of the product in the future over a long period of time, and says, I may not want to dig up all my copper right now. I may want to wait and exploit that resource in the future. Capitalists are the savers in the economy. They accumulate savings, they invest in capital, and they earn interest. And this all comes about, as you learned, from individual differences in time preferences. People with high time preferences want to consume everything right now, and people with low time preferences are going to be saving for the future. And their sacrifice is actually what gives us better houses, better office buildings, better factories, better tools, better machinery, makes us more productive, and ends up giving us higher levels of productivity and wages. And then, of course, there's the entrepreneur. An individual business owner can be working in all of those categories simultaneously. So they can be investing the money that they've saved, maybe others have saved, in resources, and they're actively spending time managing those resources, the labor, maybe cleaning the bathrooms, whatever, and may actually, their income that gets reported to the IRS may actually really have bits and pieces of all of those contributions. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but income redistribution comes in many forms, but the important forms include plunder, which is incomes that are taken from individuals in the form of taxation usually, and this redistributes income from the productive classes to the political and non-productive classes. So the people producing goods and services for consumers, they lose income. And people who don't contribute anything, the politicians, the crony capitalists in some cases, welfare recipients and so on, the non-contributors, they end up benefiting. So that's a redistribution from the productive to the non-productive. And then there's the whole issue of privilege. And you've seen bits and pieces of this in a lot of the lectures so far this week. When the government intervenes, it intervenes in such a way that creates winners and losers. And so winners and losers in each of those individual cases means a redistribution of income. So the government, for example, creates artificial rights in the economy to select individuals, or it creates opportunities for individuals to earn these artificial rights, which are also called monopoly privileges. And now we call them monopoly privileges. Doctors, call it the license to practice medicine. And so there's a lot of professions where the government requires not just, the ability to conduct yourself in a profession, but it adds in other things that protects people in those industries from competition and allows them to drive up their wages. And of course, driving up their wages and driving competitors out of that profession means that some people who would prefer to be in that profession, like say some people could be doctors, but because of the licensing requirement, they're not allowed into that profession, so they've got to go to some other profession, some lower income profession, where they've got to compete in larger numbers within that group. So the people with the licenses, they get an advantage. The people without the licenses have a disadvantage, which spills over into non-monopolized professions or competitive professions. And of course, the consumer's hurt as well. So there's lots of winners and losers. With both plunder and privilege, you get decreased production in society. So it's not a zero-sum game here. We get a net decrease in overall production and a net decrease in the standard of living. So everything is pulled downward. The only general gain here is that the state gains power or authority over the individual. So I've already gone through the fact that we looked at a lot of different aspects about why we are so unequal, that we all have, advantages and disadvantages. We all have all kinds of physical, biological differences in tastes and preferences. In the differences in tastes really boil down to everything. What we like to do, what professions we'd like to work in. Do we want to work inside or outside? Do we want to work part-time or full-time or on our own time? These are all individuated tastes. And basically, another concept that we've covered so far this week is the law of comparative advantage. That if we are allowed to and produce at those things which we have a very low opportunity cost, and then end up trading with one another, that we'll all have more to consume. We'll be producing more and we'll be consuming more, and as that law of comparative advantage influences the local, regional, national, and international markets, our comparative advantages may change, but we end up being able to produce in a more refined way what we're really good at. And as a result, overall production rises and the standard of living rises. The great thing about comparative advantage is that we all have one, and you're not stuck with it either. I mean, just because I'm a dishwasher at a certain stage of my life doesn't mean I'm going to be a dishwasher for the rest of my life. I may, develop myself, I may gain experience, I may move up within the organization, I may get some training and take on an entirely new and different job. I may go to college part-time and be able to qualify to get an entry-level position in some other profession. So we all have a comparative advantage, but we're not stuck with it. We can develop and move forward. As part of that language issue, there are a lot of dubious types of equality in the markets. Most of them are obviously wrong and at odds with reality. And all of the attempts to establish equality of result, like we may all be different, but we should have all the same income, or we may have lots of differences, but we should end up with the same amount of wealth. All of those types of proposals and schemes to create equality of results have been failing since we've tried to do those things, and that those attempts go back prior to the Roman Empire, and they all come undone, they all fail, and they can end up harming society. There are a lot of the concept of equality and inequality and different types of human systems. I list natural law, and the rule of law is offering some forms of equality and justice, but all of the political systems, from theocracy to socialism and so forth, are really caste-like systems and are basically systematic forms of injustice. If I recognize and respect other people's property rights, if we all recognize and respect other people's property rights, that's a kind of ideology of equality that makes sense, particularly to libertarians, that we all have in common that basic belief that we should recognize and respect everybody's property rights equally across the board. So that's really the only sense, and that's related to natural law and the rule of law systems. Now, starting from that initial state of comparative advantage, human development requires basically freedom and the absence of any kind of despotism or caste system. And the process of human development based on freedom recognizes the fact that for eons, humans lived at bare subsistence. But when we first started to understand, developed, and accept freedom, individual freedom, that we moved beyond subsistence. And this basically first came to a flowering during the Industrial Revolution, where the division and specialization of labor based on comparative advantage started to take place and increase productivity. The increase in productivity increased wages beyond subsistence. Really, for the first time, did we have a movement of wages beyond subsistence that was stable or sustainable in the long run. There were, prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were some experiences with wages above subsistence, but they were not sustainable. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. And so there we have basically the genesis of the process of human development. And what we know is that every role within this system, in a competitive system, in the market system, is very often harder than it might appear. It's harder than it looks. It's an amazing system when we sit back in the classroom and talk about it, but we should all understand that it's a lot more difficult on everybody than in a chalkboard type of explanation. So we get amazing results in terms of the standard of living, in terms of a tremendous increase in population, of life expectancy, and even equality of results that we were able to and we can achieve. First of all, capitalist families had to deprive themselves in order to save and to acquire capital. Most people consume all or most of what they produce. So these capitalistic families were special. Their after risk return of repayment, that was always at risk, and the return was always relatively low, given the existence of bankruptcy of creditors, market fluctuations, inflation, and taxes, which were a part of the system from a very early time. Entrepreneurs bear uncertainty with the prospects in the marketplace for profits. We do see extreme success stories, but we see extreme success stories in every profession. Guitar players, singers, actresses, ball players, boxers, entrepreneurs, every profession has its all-stars. But behind the fame and fortune is a lot of difficulties, is a lot of failures. Most entrepreneurs fail even if they produce a pretty good product, even if they treat their labor pretty good. Okay, one of my favorite pizzas of all time in my hometown, I thought, finally, we've got some good pizza. And then the guy went out of business. So just having the best product, it turns out he couldn't afford to make that great pizza and sell enough of them to cover his cost, which is what the entrepreneur has to do. So a lot of entrepreneurs lose all of their investments. Again, in review, incomes in the free market, labor, landlord, capitalist, and entrepreneur, we've covered that in what they're providing and what they're getting, but just to extend that review a little bit, it's important to know that labor gets its money right up front. Okay, so you work a week and you get paid at the end of the week. If you work a shift at the restaurant, most of your income goes home that night with you in cash. The landlord gets their money at the end of the month. Or if they own oil wells, they may get their money a couple of months later after they've provided the good. So they get paid maybe a little bit now, but they get paid over time. The capitalist also has to wait. So the capitalist has to wait while their money is essentially being used. They get paid interest after it's earned. And then the entrepreneur not only gets paid after the fact, the entrepreneur has to make sure that labor gets paid, the resource owners get paid, the capitalist or the bank gets paid, and only then, after everybody else is paid, does the entrepreneur maybe take home a paycheck, maybe earn profits, but could also earn losses. Now, so that's really the Austrian view of all of this. Income distribution. Income occurs basically in the process of production. Now, as I mentioned, Karl Marx and the socialists proposed that socialism would be more efficient, would be more productive than the anarchy of the marketplace. The socialist, and many people today see the marketplace as, oh, it's just chaotic. It doesn't make any sense. It's not well engineered, that things don't make sense. It seems like there's duplication of effort and so on. And so the socialists thought they could outdo capitalism. Mises showed why that was not going to be the case, that at best, socialism was inefficient. After the downfall of communism, the socialists, such as Robert Heilbrunner, admitted Mises was right. And Heilbrunner and many others, including Thomas Piketty, said, well, we're going to change our whole strategy. Socialism may not be more productive, but it's better at achieving equity or equality, and it's better for ecology or ecological reasons, better for the environment. And so they've switched stories to providing equality through welfare and progressive income taxes and environmental protection against global warming and against climate change. Of course, the main goal is more power over the individual. I'm going to skip that and move right on to this final myth of inequality in America. And I would recommend this book, The Myth of American Inequality, by Phil Graham, Robert Eklund, and John Early. It addresses all of the issues associated with income inequality and wealth inequality, mobility, poverty, work effort, productivity, everything under the sun that's related to this topic. If you're in economics, or you need to write a paper on this subject, or you're going to graduate school on this in economics or related disciplines, this book takes you through all of the economics and statistics of this issue, and does so very effectively, I think, and shows a much truer picture of inequality in America. And it basically looks at the period between the mid-1960s and the present. The mid-1960s is when the war on poverty started, when welfare started on a very large scale in the United States. And it re-examines all of the statistics over that time period. And it finds that government statistics that you have been exposed to, that have been a part of all those memes and articles and graphs that you've seen, they're all fundamentally wrong because they don't count all of the amount of welfare dollars that is given away in the United States. In fact, it doesn't even account for the majority of welfare dollars given away in the United States. It doesn't account for all of the tax dollars taken from American income earners. It doesn't, it does account for more than half of all taxes taken, but it misses huge swaths of tax dollars taken from American income earners. As a result, it presents a completely biased picture and gives you all of those results about how America is very unequal in terms of economic results, that we're stingy in terms of giving away benefits to welfare recipients, people on poverty programs. The number of poverty programs in the United States at the federal level is over 100 different programs. And then there's a lot of state-specific programs as well. I'd never even heard of most of them, but there's significant tax dollars involved. So that's a very important book. And I want to give you a couple of the general points here from the book. And this is income distribution over this period. The book was published in 2022, but this refers to the entire period. And the dashed line, starting down here, and then moving up, is the actual income of the top 20% of income earners, the next lower 20% of income earners, and then down here is the lowest 20% of income earners. This is how much money they ultimately received from income plus welfare programs. So you can see that people down here in the bottom are either not working at all or working very little. The people in the lowest quintile, the bottom 20%, worked on average 2.4 hours a week. So there's very little work effort, and a lot of that is because if they don't work, they qualify for a lot more welfare programs. So they're earning a few $1,000s here, but they're taking home a total of $50,000 per household in total benefits. And that's way higher than almost all of the European economies. On the taxation side, this dashed line represents incomes. So indeed, the top quintile earns a lot of income, but the dashed red line is all the taxes they pay. So the wealthy, the high income groups in the United States pay way more in taxes than any of its OECD or European counterparts. The United States soaks the rich more than any country in the world. So that's just not, that whole idea that the US is somehow the least egalitarian country is not true. And then finally, it's also important to note, as a taste of what you'll find in the book, is This is the US poverty rate from World War II to the present. And after World War II, the poverty rate in the United States fell precipitously and only leveled out once the welfare programs went into effect. They were projected, if there were no welfare programs, poverty would be about 2.5% to 3%. And I'm going to borrow a minute of your time because it's important to understand the equality depopulation connection. Depopulating an economy does drive up wages and does create equality. The Black Death in Europe created a lot of equality in Europe. The early part of the 20th century created a lot of equality in the United States after World War II, because millions of people were killed in World War I from the Spanish flu, from the Great Depression, and from World War II. It literally wiped out a huge percentage of young people who were coming into their family formation years. And so family formation and population in the United States and many other countries fell precipitously. And as a result, after World War II, labor was relatively scarce compared to capital in the United States. And it created some more income inequality. But that's really not a great way to achieve equality. You know, in other words, if we blew up a bunch of nuclear weapons around the world and killed off a lot of people, we'd get more income inequality. But that's really not, you know, it just seems to me, I may be wrong, but just thinking about reality, I don't think that's really a good idea. Thank you very much.